Well, welcome to the second episode of Factually Incorrect with Bill Weinberg of countervortex.org, where we call out the fiction-spewing bloviators, whether of the right or the left, who are polluting cyberspace with their inaccuracies and propaganda. And unfortunately, we are going to have to take on a particularly noxious video today, which was recently produced by Ben Swan of the rather ironically named Reality Check, perhaps better dubbed Unreality Check, who in his latest episode is giving a big fat wet kiss to the genocidal regime of Bashar Assad in Syria, and echoing regime propaganda about the siege of Aleppo, which we just witnessed.
But why are these people in Aleppo celebrating in the streets? Just listen to what they're doing.
Why are people celebrating in the streets? Well, Ben Swan, do you think it might have to do with the fact that a brutal dictatorship is back in control of Aleppo once again and people are afraid for their lives? Are you aware that the United Nations Human Rights Commission earlier this year accused the Bashar Assad regime of a campaign of extermination against elements of the populace which are believed to be disloyal to the regime? And if you aren't dancing around in the streets and pretending that you've been liberated, you're likely to be dragged off to prison, disappeared, killed, tortured, starved to death, or worse. Have you been paying any attention to what's going on in Syria, Ben? Not to mention that this conveniently ignores the fact that 50,000 people did not celebrate in the streets, but chose to abandon their homes and go into an uncertain exile, to actually flee the city and go to Idlib Governorate, which is continuing to be bombed by the regime. That's how desperate people were to get away. Ignoring the fact that when regime troops first entered Aleppo, they were going house to house and massacring the populace in what the United Nations called a complete breakdown of humanity. And you're going to dismiss all of this on account of a video that shows some people dancing in the streets?
Syria's so-called Free Syrian Army rebels have been disbanded. They no longer even exist. The U.S. actually trained moderate rebels in Syria, but according to the Pentagon, those moderates gave all their U.S.-provided weapons to al-qaeda in Syria, known as al-Nusra Front. By late 2015, the largest group battling Assad became the Islamic State. To be clear, the Syrian government is battling ISIS and al-qaeda, not rebels. Those are provable facts and admitted by our own government, and yet for some reason most media refuses to even mention the names ISIS or al-qaeda when talking about Aleppo, and instead only refer to these fighters as rebels.
Well, no, in fact, these are not provable facts. They are, on the contrary, easily refutable lies. The FSA has not been disbanded. The FSA, to begin with, was a loose coalition of militias, those which fly the Free Syrian flag and have some kind of nominal loyalty to the Syrian National Council, which is the umbrella group of various opposition forces, pro-democratic opposition forces in Syria. It hasn't been disbanded. There are still it's still a significant element of the forces which were defending Aleppo, and there's very good reason that most media don't talk about ISIS or Nusra Front when they're discussing Aleppo, because neither ISIS nor Nusra Front are in Aleppo, okay? ISIS attempted to establish a stronghold in Aleppo 2 years ago, in 2014, and they were driven out of the city by the Free Syrian Army, by the rebels, which you are dissing and calling ISIS. And as for the Nusra Front, they were disbanded. Unlike the FSA, the Nusra Front was formally disbanded this year. And they reorganized themselves, gave themselves a new name called the Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, the Army of the Conquest of Syria. And they organizationally cut off their ties with al-qaeda. So they no longer are affiliated with al-qaeda. And we still don't like them. They're still conservative Islamists. But they are no longer al-qaeda, and they are no longer the Nusra Front. And they are no longer, we can assume, they're no longer concerned with attacking the West. And calling them al-qaeda is just patently dishonest. and factually incorrect.
Assad and the Syrian Arab Army, the actual Syrian army, with the help of the Russians, began a military campaign to take back eastern Aleppo, which is controlled by terror groups.
Rebel is a factually objective term. If you're taking up arms against the government, you're a rebel. Whereas terror group is a propaganda term. Governments and dictatorships typically call any rebel group that they don't like terror groups. So you're just echoing propaganda right there.
Assad and the Syrian Arab Army, the actual Syrian army.
Now, what you refer to as the actual Syrian army, quote unquote, is not actually the Syrian army. Okay, the Syrian army is what has nearly collapsed, along with the Bashar Assad dictatorship having nearly collapsed before it was propped up by foreign intervention, propped up by Russian airstrikes, and propped up by foreign militia forces. So what you're actually calling the actual Syrian army is in fact the Russian Air Force, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. That's who was actually leading the so-called regime offensive into Aleppo. Not the actual Syrian army, but a foreign mercenary army.
On Sunday, buses were sent into eastern Aleppo to evacuate civilians by the Syrian government. But al-Nusra fighters set fire to those buses. Why? Because al-Nusra and ISIS are reportedly trying to block the evacuation of civilians from eastern Aleppo as they use those civilians for cover.
Those buses that were burnt were not, in fact, in Aleppo. You weren't paying attention, Ben Swan. Those buses that were burnt were in Shiite villages in Idlib governorate, which were under siege by rebel forces, not in Aleppo. And apparently there were some hardline rebel forces which were besieging these villages which did not want to lift the siege. And that was the deal which the UN was trying to impose, where the population of East Aleppo would be allowed to be evacuated by the Assad regime in exchange for the rebels lifting their sieges of these Shiite villages. So that's where the buses were burnt. The buses were not burnt in Aleppo. That was factually incorrect.
There is not an attack on civilians being conducted by the Syrian government. Rescuers claim that hospitals in eastern Aleppo have been the primary target of the bombardment since this campaign for the eastern part of Aleppo began. It sounds horrific. But again, what virtually no national media is reporting, according to reports from those on the ground, like journalist Vanessa Beeley, there are only 3 hospitals in eastern Aleppo, and they are almost exclusively inhabited by al-qaeda and ISIS fighters.
Ben Swan, are you really arguing that the regime was not attacking civilians and was not targeting hospitals in Aleppo? Why don't you check with a bona fide human rights organization which has actually been monitoring the situation? Why don't you go ask Doctors Without Borders? Why don't you go ask Amnesty International? Why don't you go ask Physicians for Human Rights? And all of them will tell you that the Russian Air Force and the regime have been systematically targeting hospitals in rebel-held Aleppo and in the other rebel-held areas of Syria. And there were rebel fighters in those hospitals? Well, yes, I suppose there were wounded rebel fighters who were being treated in those hospitals, just like there were plenty of civilians who were being treated in those hospitals. What about the children's hospital in Aleppo that was bombed on November 19th? Because I suppose those were little children terrorists who were bombed?
The White Helmets are an NGO that claims it has no connection to any group in the Syrian fight, and they are simply there to provide help to the injured and wounded civilians. They were nominated in 2016 for the Nobel Peace Prize, but here's what you may not know. The White Helmets are actually receiving $100 million in funding from the United States, the UK, Japan, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Germany.
So what? They're receiving funding from foreign governments. Gee, imagine that. For once our government is funding the good guys for a change. For once our tax dollars are being put to use for people who are actually rescuing civilians who are being bombed instead of bombing civilians. Imagine that. What a terrible thing. That certainly delegitimizes the White Helmets. The fact that they're actually getting some aid from foreign governments. As well they should. It would be a bigger disgrace if they weren't getting aid from foreign governments.
Because on any given night, you're shown video of bombed out buildings.
Yes, the media are showing burnt out buildings instead of people celebrating, because the media are doing their job of actually covering a war and not just giving you regime propaganda. Imagine that.
There is no question that al-Qaeda and ISIS are the driving force against Assad in Syria. So when media talks about those groups as a great threat to the world in every nation except for Syria, where they're only referred to as rebels.
Now, this is the most disgusting thing of all, which is writing the Syrian civil resistance out of the story completely. The Syrian revolution began back in March of 2011 when school children began painting slogans on walls calling for the downfall of the regime, such as it happened in Tunisia and it happened in Egypt. And for this, the school children were arrested. And that's when there were a wave of nonviolent protest across the country calling for the downfall of the regime, calling for a democratic opening in Syria. And this peaceful, secular, pro-democratic movement was drowned in blood, serially massacred by the regime, until finally, in desperation, people began to take up arms and to form the Free Syrian Army. And then the Free Syrian Army, contrary to the nonsense that you will hear from propagandists like Ben Swann, received all too little support from the outside world and were essentially betrayed and left to their own devices, and the revolution was left to be slaughtered by a genocidal regime. And that is when the jihadists began to gain a foothold. And then when the jihadists begin to gain a foothold, then propagandists like Ben Swann say, oh, they're all jihadists, which is utterly, utterly cynical. And in fact, despite this destructive dynamic that we've seen, where the legitimate revolution has been betrayed and the jihadists have gained more and more of a foothold, you want to know what? The legitimate revolution continues to survive, and the civil, pro-democratic, secular resistance movement, which began the revolution way back in March of 2011, continues to exist. Even in Aleppo under siege, it continued to exist. Neighborhood councils running their own affairs in opposition to the regime, calling for a secular and democratic Syria. And if you don't know about it, it's because you haven't bothered to find out. Why don't you try visiting the website of the Syrian nonviolence movement? Why don't you try visiting the website Adopt a Revolution? Why don't you try visiting the website of the Syrian Democratic Revolution? And then you would know, instead of dishonestly pretending that the Syrian Revolution does not exist. So, no, that's not what there is no question of. I'll tell you what there's no question of. There is no question of this, that you, Ben Swann, are a liar. You are a liar on behalf of a genocidal dictatorship. You are a disgrace to journalism, and you are a disgrace to humanity. This has been the second episode of Factually Incorrect with Bill Weinberg of countervortex.org. Please remember to like and subscribe.